Hello, it's the One Nerd, and this is an update, vlog 2 of the JS13kGames game competition. So I've made a lot of progress today actually. I really just put pedals to the metal and started prototyping this a few more, getting a better idea of what exactly I wanted to do and how exactly I was going to go about doing it. So I've sort of been mulling around a few, 5 days really, just trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do. So I'm going to show a time lapse of the entire 4 or 5 hours that I spent working on it so far, and just talk through exactly my thought processes while I was doing it. I mean, it's in a much better state now. The actual project itself is called, the working title anyway, is Superposition. The theme of this JS13kGames game jam this time is space. So I've developed an idea which is based on that somewhat, and I'll just play the time lapse now and just sort of narrate it. So this is just when I was starting off, just really getting a scene going with A-frame, adding some shapes. At first I wanted to create I was thinking of creating a game that was sort of like an interactive fiction of some sort, but in 3D. But I did actually scrap that idea after not so long. But this is just me just adding seeing how I can add text. Basically just getting used to A-frame again, like positioning objects, adding primitives and that sort of thing. The working title at this point was Geometric Space, just a generic title really, just because I wasn't exactly sure what I was doing. I just wanted to experiment a bit first, get some stuff down, see what I could do. I had this idea at first of connecting nodes, so you'd link to different passages and then somehow you'd navigate through them. Then further along the line I sort of thought, well, I need to implement VR. I need to think of how you can navigate these spaces in VR. But yeah, at this point I was just sort of saying, oh, how can I add text? How can I started experimenting with textures, so I went into GIMP, trying to define a sort of aesthetic that I wanted. So there's a skybox there you can see with a green sort of almost toxic waste thing. This is initial work, just adding some walls. Initially I was going to create a boxed room. I scrapped that idea further along the line, but you'll see that further along. So yeah, I just spent a lot of time just creating a cube space and adding it. Again, I was also playing with the idea of creating a texture for the exit sign, so you could go for have to find an exit. My initial idea was to get it so that you could dodge shapes, and then if you hit a shape then you'd be taken out. But so a lot of this was just messing around with that idea, like animation as well in A-frame. All of this at this point is just adding HTML for A-frame with animation. Wasn't really doing much JavaScript at this point. Just trying to figure out exactly what is the idea I have here. So looking at a lot of documentation, I was trying to figure out exactly how I'd get the gaze cursor thing to work, and just playing it really. So this is all playing, to be honest. Trying to figure out how do I want the cubes to move. That would be a major part of the gameplay mechanic, of course. So still doing that, playing with aesthetics, I've done some circuit board texture, just started playing with that, obviously to make it small because it needs to be small. I was thinking of going for inside a computer sort of vibe, which changed as the idea changed, but you'll see further along where that is so. So this is mostly just defining aesthetic and just sort of playing around with the positions of the cubes. That we're going to have some sort of aspects in the gameplay, but I wasn't exactly sure at this point how. So again, just more fiddling with that, creating a cube room, fiddling. Listen to Blade Runner. Adding some lighting, so I started adding some lighting just to give it a bit more of a interesting feeling aesthetically. Doing the same thing here. I think I started adding fog just to play with that. So yeah, I was just going to play around with this idea of having a modal interface for some aspect, so just downloaded it, like got that up. I'm going to probably revisit that actually later on after done this prototype I'm in for the end of the game, just to show you final score, but I'll talk about that later. Because initially it was going to be that when you were hit by one of these cubes, it would like deduct a life, deduct your score, or just kill you outright. But I did scrap this idea after a while. But this is where I was going at this point in the time lapse. So yeah, I was just experimenting with that, doing texture work, blah 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 blah. So at this point trying to get an idea of like, well, what do I want to go next for this? I was a bit stuck. Wasn't exactly sure, because without implementing a physics system it would be quite difficult, I think. Well, I mean, it was probably doable, but I wasn't exactly sure how to do the collisions without a physics system, which would be a lot of extra space that would go well over the 30 kilobytes. I think there's probably a way to do it with A-frame, but without using the A-frame physics system I wasn't exactly sure, so I was looking at, I think I was doing some research on that at this point. I was experimenting with adding red lighting. I just wanted to work on the aesthetic still, the atmosphere, reading up on just the demo. Yeah, this is where I was just seeing if it's even possible to add the physics system without it being huge. So I had the minified physics system, but it was too big. Way too big for what would be required. So, I mean, one of the good things about this competition is you have to work with a limitation, the size limitation, which is a big limitation. So that's actually good, because it really gets you to think creatively about how you structure your code, but also what libraries you can rely on and how you do things. So you have to really be creative. So that was very positive actually. It's really forced me to implement the fly camera just so it's testing mostly, because that wouldn't really work in VR mode really. I don't know what I was doing here. I think I was just flying around and just trying to get a sense of where things were at. This is where I started to get sort of stuck, like, oh crap, how do I move on with this thing? How do I progress, and how do I make this actually into a game that's actually workable, or is interesting, or is playable? So yeah, I was just sort of fiddling and trying to get a clue of, I mean, I spent a lot of time during this time just staring at the screen like, oh my god, what am I going to do? I was thinking of having the camera so it would be above, so it's going to more of like a top-down view. So I spent some time fiddling with that. Ultimately scrapped this, but it's a lot of work just to get the positioning right, and everything. Using the inspector to look at things and look at what the best angle would be for the... So yeah, I was doing a lot of that. That was about 5 days ago, I think I was doing this. Just trying to get... And then I was thinking more of like having like intersecting cube points, which would move across, be a cross section. It looks really weird on here because it's going super fast, but it didn't look like that in the actual thing itself, just because it's sped up so much. It looks like quite trippy actually, flickering. But basically these were like intersecting cubes, which would go vertical and horizontal. And I think the idea at this point was to like sort of have it so you had to gaze at each one and destroy each one, and they would run in a loop. But I did eventually scrap that idea. Playing a bit more with textures again, trying to create smaller ones, also just create some more grainy textures, I suppose. So yeah, just working on the aesthetic again, removed all the walls. I thought I'd just go back to basics and create some more like a basic working prototype, I suppose. And that's pretty much what I'm doing here. I was very stuck at this point. This is almost where I gave up on the thing, because I was just sort of at a loss as to what I could do, which is proving to be very frustrating actually. Very frustrating. So I was getting a bit frustrated at this point. I didn't know exactly where to take this. I was running a bit out of steam on it, in all true honesty, and just like randomly changing positions, trying to think if any spark would spark in my brain, and then I'd get a good idea and be like, okay, that works. But I was really struggling at this point. This is the lowest point probably of the development phase of this small little game. So then I sort of got onto this idea of just having everything going down vertically like this, almost like Tetris, I suppose, and try and do something with that. So I coloured everything so that I could very easily identify which cube was which. So you can sort of see that here's like a vertical descending cubes. I'm going to try and do something like that, and then this is where I got into the idea of and started experimenting with the gaze cursor, so that it does something or changes colour or destroys itself when I had to look into that a bit. I wasn't exactly sure of how to do that. This is pretty much almost from today. So like I did majority, a lot of the work I did on this was actually done today. So I got a real session on, I got into the zone, as it were, with the code. So this is me just trying to implement the when you gaze at the cursor at the object, it does something. I looked at a few examples, tried to get it to work, I was struggling a bit, wasn't really identifying anything. I was again looking at code pens and things, having some trouble with it. Not sure what I'm doing there. And then really the breakthrough will come soon, but before this, I was still just like trying to figure out, like, I'll have these blocks of descending blocks, trying to reduce the size of the textures again, the assets, which now I don't think I'm actually using any textures now. So I changed the texture to this, like, this is from this morning, this is to like this, like, lines, almost like Mayan lines or something like that. And I decided I'll just use that, go back to really basics, like use one texture for everything and then just change the color. So I started doing that. I started playing around with trying to get something to happen when I looked at something. I looked back at a previous project I worked on, which was with A-frame, just to get some inspiration, because it was just to help me. So I was looking at that, copying a bit of code from that, changing it, modifying it, of course, but just trying to get some inspiration from previous code I've written. That's when I did this experiment, which is basically I did this older project where I generated some 3D shapes in the space in the A-frame, and so I copied some code, reorganized it a bit from my old project, and decided that I'd go along this more like generative. So it's like generated on the fly. There's a bit of randomization in terms of the positioning. So it's in the JavaScript, it's actually generating these shapes. Whereas before I was just doing it with the HTML elements. So I think this is a better approach, and this is ultimately where I had my breakthrough moments. So at this point I'm just trying to get animation working. So when I've added these new, it's a for loop, and then it just creates a bunch of boxes. And I wanted to do it so that it would then do an animation that would loop. So I spent a bit of time messing around with that. I've got the objects to spawn in, as you can probably see just about, and then I needed to do it so that they could update their position and loop, which was really quite a breakthrough moment when I eventually got that working, which should be in about a minute or so. So I eventually got that working. I had a little bit of faffing around with exactly the attributes I had to add and how and what order and everything else. Because initially it wasn't looping, so it would just go and just stay, which is a bit annoying. So that's what I'm sort of playing around with here. And I sort of trashed the idea of having like a floor. I wanted to make it there you go. So this is the breakthrough moment, I'd say, where I've got these objects, they're like in a 3-dimensional space, 360 degrees rotation. And this is where I started to think of a new idea, which is maybe you get points by looking at certain objects in the space, and then other objects will reduce your score. So that is basically the core mechanic of now. I changed the background to like a sort of light green, neon green background. So I changed the way I was adding the cursor, and again, like, this is the breakthrough moments really. So I think soon coming up is where I actually got the gaze changing the color attribute of the box, so I just managed to do that. So I was just about on the cusp of doing that, I think. So I think I looked at some more demos, documentation, obviously going back to basics, and I figured out that I figured out how to change the color. So I figured out that how to look at the box and have it change the attribute of the color of the register component A-frame. So that worked, and I was very happy about that, because that was a big eureka moment, because I was struggling with that. That was one of the main things I wanted to do. The rest of it was sort of just adding decrement the score, increment the score. So the score is just a variable of type let at the top, and I just decrement the score. In terms of the actual programming of this thing, I actually do want to tidy it up a bit. I'm going through that process in a minute. That'll be the next stage. And also and then I added some sound. So I started creating some sound with beatbox, so I just really basically, literally like half a bar, and also tried to do some music, but I couldn't really compress it enough to fit in with the size it had to be played. So I've just ended up using just a decrement score and an increment score sound, which is hard enough as it is. They're still like 2 kilobytes each, even then compressed to the max. So compress those MP3 files to the max that I could compress them. It took a little bit of time, a little bit of experimentation before they were a few meg. So I had to really compress them as much as I could. Obviously just added those sounds to play when you get incremented or decremented in the score, which is good. So then, trying to think of, like, because obviously, like, you can't really, sounds are really funny with, unless you've interacted with the view somehow, it sometimes blocks sound. So I was just messing around with that a little bit, then I've scrapped that idea for now, because you have to move anyway at first before you can even interact with anything at this point. I might have to revisit that somewhat. Just sort of like fiddling now, adding a timer, total time variable, just so that the timer decreases, so it starts at 50 and decreases from there. This is what I'm doing here. It's like a game loop I created of some game state from what I remember. It's very fast, so it's hard to tell, but this is where it started to really become the mechanic of the game, which is essentially you get points for viewing the white ones, or not in the final version, but in this version, the white things give you a plus, the red give you a minus. So you have to gaze quickly and make sure it doesn't just. There we go. So like it started to look a bit better. I was messing around, screwing around with the amount as well of shapes, which I'm still probably going to play with a bit. Added the timer, added the score. Now this is looking like something like a game. And then this is like the second breakthrough I had today. So I like these cubes. They were all right, but I wanted to make something that was a bit more conceptual maybe in its view. So I sort of decided a little further on from this, I think, to change the overall aesthetic somewhat. After I'd done all this and done some fiddling, I decided that I'd call the game Superposition, which is based vaguely on the physics concept. I had to change the font because it looked terrible before. It's Times New Roman or something, I think, made it a bit smaller. And then I decided to make these cubes into just messing a bit with the fog and stuff here, messing with the lights, just fiddling a bit. So I made the cubes into spheres, because if it was going to be superposition, I wanted it to be more like atoms in a space rather than cubes. So I did that, changed the scale a bit. It was a bit too big before, modified the scale, and changed the colours, changed it back to black eventually in the background as well. You can't really tell that much the gameplay here but it's basically 50 seconds. You've got to get the correct, and then I've committed it to GitHub. That's what I'm doing there, very fast obviously. And that's pretty much where I'm up to now. Like this game where you've got a light blue, and so that's the time that's done now. And that's pretty much where I'm up to with the prototype. I'm really happy with the progress I made today. I'm glad that I had a sort of final brainwave for it. I think I'll leave that at that, because this is already 20 minutes of a long video, so it's pretty long. I'll do a final wrapping up video, I think, so there's probably only one more video left in this series. And like and subscribe obviously if you like the content. Hope that was interesting. I know I really had to rush through it because I had a time lapse. It's like 4 or 5 hours of content of the recording into like 15 minutes or whatever. It's timed up. I made it, sped it up by like 2,000, but it's still quite long. But yeah, so await the next vlog. Hope you enjoyed that. I've been Noah Nerd. In a bit.